All right. So tonight we begin the book of Daniel. And only God himself knows how long we'll be in it.
Yeah.
It's got 12 chapters.
And there's a lot there.
And there's a lot there. So it's really a very exciting book. Now, I will say this to begin with. If you don't like history, you're going to absolutely hate this week. If you like history, that's most of what you're going to get this week, because I have to give you the historical background of the book. If you don't understand all the events in history that were going on, we'll show you maps and everything on the screen here, you really won't catch why Daniel is where he is, why the Jews are where they are, the exile, etc. So there's going to be so let's start first about Daniel, the author. Now, Daniel, per the testimony of his contemporaries, was a real person who, of course, lived in the 6th century BC and was famous for his wisdom and his righteous character. Turn to Ezekiel 14, back from Daniel, just a book.
6th century, this is when?
It was 600s. Daniel, well, you'll see. You're going to see that in
the first page, Daniel, you've already got us in Ezekiel.
I've got you in Ezekiel. So, fortunately, you'll have to go backwards to the last one book. So go to Ezekiel chapter 14. Now, in a minute, you'll understand why I'm taking you here. Ezekiel 14, in verse 14, we've read this before. It's talked about how Ezekiel says that God will judge any nation that shows tremendous unrighteousness, and he tells how he's going to do it and all this. And it starts in 13 where it says, Son of man, if a country sins against me by committing unfaithfulness, I stretch out my hand against it and destroy its supply of bread, send famine against it, and cut off from it both man and beast. Verse 14 is what we're looking at. And even though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst, in other words, living in that country, by their own righteousness they could only deliver themselves, declares the Lord. And of course, interestingly enough, as he goes on in this passage, he reiterates this several times. And he says, even if this happened, and even if Noah and Daniel and Job were in that country, okay, actually says it, if I remember, 3 times. So Ezekiel knows Daniel, clearly, does he not? Now, also, you'll see a mention, turn from the 14th chapter to the 28th chapter of Ezekiel. Ezekiel 28. In verse 3, Ezekiel makes a statement, Behold, you are wiser than Daniel, and there is no secret that is matched for you. So again, Daniel is notorious for his wisdom. It's interesting because Daniel, in the Hebrew Bible, now remember, there's Mikey. The Hebrew Bible is not, it has the same books in it as our Old Testament, but the Hebrew Bible, it does not organize its books the same way. So it starts out like our Bible does, in the first 5 books called the Torah, but then it has a second group of books which are called the prophets, and they lump a whole bunch of prophets together in a different order than we put them in our Bible. And then there's a third group in the Hebrew Bible called the writings. And this is actually where Daniel is in the Hebrew Bible. Now, the reason why probably Daniel is put in the writing section rather than the prophetic section, according to the Hebrew Bible, is probably twofold. First of all, Daniel was primarily a government official in two different administrations, Babylon and then later Media-Persia. So he's not in Israel because we're going to see the story. He's exiled. From the time he's young, he doesn't live in Israel, though he obviously knows the Torah and the writings extremely well. But the other thing I think it's important is that Daniel's message was primarily aimed not at the Jews, but it was predictive of the Gentile world. And that's one of the things that's really unique about the book of Daniel. Here this Hebrew writer, who's this administrator in Babylon, writes about Gentile history. Now, obviously, Israel fits into that Gentile history, but you're going to see how extensively he writes about Gentile history as we get into the second and third chapters of the book. Now, we know that Daniel was born into some portion of the Jewish royal family. And you can see this in the first chapter of Daniel. If you turn to, I think it's verses 3 and 6. So in verse 3, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of their nobles. So, what happens is, and we're going to go through this, when Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to Jerusalem and finally conquers it, which occurs in approximately 605 BC, once he conquers the city, breaches the walls, he then collects the most educated, the most promising, the best of the best, and takes them back to Babylon. They're exiled because they're going to be trained and used in the Babylonian government.
So why he did that?
Because it was a tradition of the Babylonians to do that. They would take the best of the best of cultures that they conquered, bring them back and spend years training them, teaching them Aramaic, which is the language of the Babylonians. Okay? And then they would
like bringing the best genetic material?
Possibly that. Certainly the brightest, the ones that would function the best. Because remember, we're going to see the history. Once Babylon becomes a great empire, it's a huge empire. There's got to be a lot of government officials. The Babylonians were notorious, as well as the Persians were, for writing a lot. I mean, we have tens of thousands of clay tablets of the Babylonians and the Persians about every kind of law and guide, and it's kind of like watching the IRS Code of the United States or something. There's a lot of stuff they wrote, and they had to administer all of these things, and they had a very structured legal code in their culture. So
you would think they would want only their people to run their country.
Well, they subscribe to a different view, and that is, instead of simply annihilating those people they conquered, they figured, why not utilize the brain power? And it just was a tradition of what they did. The Media-Persians often did this too, so not every culture did it, but certainly they did. So we see also, of course, did we read verse 6? Also in verse 6, now among them, the sons of Judah were Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These are the three guys his age that go with him. So we know this is something about Daniel. He comes somehow from a royal family in Judah. Now,
also nice looking.
Yeah, they were. Yes, they were. They picked. We'll go through that. They picked the best looking, those that looked the most promising by stature, intellect, and all these things. Now, They were taken to captivity in 605 BC, as I said, by Nebuchadnezzar's army. We know for a fact that Daniel lived at least until the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus of Media-Persia. The Media-Persians conquered Babylon in a very spectacularly unusual way in approximately 536 in one fell swoop. They took over literally in a night in Babylon. It was remarkable. Of course, it was predicted by God that Cyrus would do this. So we know that Daniel writes in the 3rd year of Cyrus. If you add that together, you know that Daniel had to have lived at least until 85 years of age. Okay, so he was taken, most people believe he was somewhere between 12 and 15 years old. And he was taken and lived till about the age of 85. So he never made it back to Israel. He was not among those individuals that when Cyrus sent, the 50,000 or so that went back, we studied that, and he was not of them. Maybe he had died at this point, we don't know. Think about this, though, from a personal standpoint. He's a 12, 13, or 14, or 15-year-old kid. We don't know that his family was exiled with him. We have no knowledge about that. There's certainly no evidence in the book that they were. He's taken to his foreign culture. He has to be moved. It's about 500 miles from Israel to Babylon. It certainly would conservatively take 30 days, even if you're going, 15, 17 miles a day traveling, which probably would be pushing it. Maybe it took 45 days to travel to get there, And of course, we're going to learn that he is put in a 3-year training program with his 3 friends and certainly plenty of other people. Think about, here he is. He's seen many people in his city killed. He's seen them invade. He's seen a lot of, undoubtedly his relatives died. We know a good part of the royal family died during this time when Nebuchadnezzar came in. So, he may be in a sense a virtual orphan as he's taken here to Babylon. It's I want you to know this because when you look at his character and look at what he does, it's just absolutely remarkable. Daniel's definitely one of those people that we absolutely admire. Now, even though his writing, the book of Daniel, is in the book of writings in the Jewish Bible, Jesus calls him a prophet. And you don't have to turn here, but it's found in Matthew 24:15, where he talks about Daniel the prophet, when he's talking about the end days in chapter 24. So he is clearly a prophet, even though, his major business, if you want to put it this way, was prophecy, but it was primarily, of course, in the capacity of being an administrator. Now, Daniel is a highly disputed book. There are many, many critics about its authorship and its date, and there's a fundamental reason why they criticize this book. It's because it's full of prophecy, and especially because of the 11th chapter of this book. And whenever we get to it, okay?
Next year.
Yeah, undoubtedly next year, okay? You will see that it is an extremely detailed prophetic story of the battles and reigns and fall and rise of the Ptolemaic and Seleucid kings. It talks about their wives, it talks about their marriages at times, and so the critics of this book cannot accept that God would give someone 350 years advance notice about all this information. So therefore, since they can't believe that God would be predictive this way, they simply say, well, the book couldn't have been written by Daniel. It's just a pseudonym, and it had to be written maybe after 175 BC when all this stuff had occurred. Of course, it's completely ridiculous from the standpoint of the integrity of the Bible. We've already seen thousands of examples of God predicting things that came true, so why would we not believe this? You know, but if you read in commentaries, you'll see this.
Who are the critics?
Oh, there's many. I mean, the critics in theological seminaries are by the thousands that have looked at this book. They try to nominalize it. They try to say that it's not really predictive. It's allegorical. It isn't literal. You know, and yet, you know, as I'm said here in E, the book of Daniel is probably the most pivotal book of all biblical prophecy. Prophecy, you cannot understand the book of Revelation if you have not understood the book of Daniel. The outline of Revelation is found in the book of Daniel. And so it's absolutely critical to end time prophecy to understand this book.
Does that mean that the critics don't find belief in Revelations?
No, they say it's an allegory. They say it's a story. They say,
Revelations is a story?
oh yeah, yeah,
Seriously?
oh yes. There are only there are a small number of seminaries in the world today, in the United States today, that would teach Daniel verse by verse, literally like I'm going to. Most of them would dismiss it, never look at it, allegorize it. You could go to Dallas Theological Seminary and they would teach it well, okay? You could go to Trinity Divinity School, you could go to Trinity Theological Seminary. There's places around that still would conservative Bible teaching seminaries, but they're highly outnumbered by the liberal seminaries of the world, okay?
Why and how are the liberal seminaries not teaching what they should be teaching?
Because
God's plan to have that occur?
that's a very good question. I can try to partially answer it. The reason why is because of the change that occurred just at the end of the 19th century. What happened in Germany is that the seminaries in Germany developed a viewpoint about the scriptures. They call it higher biblical criticism. That's what they called it. And they started to analyze the Bible from the standpoint of a viewpoint of human reason and a humanistic concept. Okay, it was no longer a supernatural book. It was no longer written by individuals that were divinely inspired. It was no longer without error from their standpoint, and that's what we call liberal theology. It started in Europe, but it spread. And prior to 1920, approximately, if you would have gone to Yale Seminary, if you would have gone to Harvard Theological Seminary, Princeton Theological Seminary, you know, you would have, if they taught Daniel, they would have taught Daniel the way I'm teaching Daniel. Okay? But after that time, the liberal viewpoint swept through those seminaries. Professors were changed, curricula was changed, and this higher biblical criticism became the norm. So if you go to the average seminary, if you went to Yale, Harvard, or seminary today and you asked them, is the Bible inspired word of God, they would say no.
Seriously?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, think about it. If you were Satan and you wanted to point
Absolutely.
to people, where would you start?
That's smart, because you would go to the seminaries and you would cause the future teachers of the Bible to be taught in a way that's not correct, and then of course you could corrupt generations, which is exactly what's happened. You know, try to find very many churches in this. If you went to a Presbyterian church, do you think you'd ever hear the book of Daniel taught? If you went to a Methodist church, do you think you'd ever hear the book of Daniel? If you went to United Church of Christ, would you ever hear the book of Daniel? If you went to Episcopalian church, Lutheran church, any of those churches, you'd never hear it taught. Ever. They don't teach the Bible. They use the Bible to talk about stories or encourage people to be good or teach people to be nice, or, you know, if you go to the average Methodist church, you're going to hear a sermon on, I read a great book this week. You know, that's what you'll hear.
But they start with scripture.
Well, they'll take a provisional scripture, read one, and then go off on their topic, which is called, you know, not exegesis, but eisegesis. Okay, that's the word. You know, when you teach from the verses and the words, it's called exegesis. That's the method. That's the way we teach here. It's exegetical. This is the way, you know, if you go to Ironside, if you go to the great teachers and preachers, you know, of the 20th and 19th century, they all taught exegetically out of the words. So that's what's happened. That's why Daniel is a very disputed book, because of that. Now, also, it's a unique book in another respect. It's the only book where chapters 2 through 7 in the book are written in Aramaic. They're not written in Hebrew. It's unique. None of the Bible's that way. Why, of course? Because what was the political language that Daniel had to learn? Aramaic. So he wrote it in Aramaic, part of it. Part of it he wrote in Hebrew. Okay? Now, there's another extremely unique characteristic of the book of Daniel, and that is chapter 4.
Yeah.
There is no other book in the entire Bible that has a chapter 4 like the book of Daniel. Because you know who the author was of chapter 4? King Nebuchadnezzar. He wrote chapter 4. And as I say in my notes here, you know, don't be surprised one day if you rub elbows with him in heaven. Because he had a big learning curve. You'll see the story. He had a big learning curve.
In 2 through 7, is it in the Quran,
No.
given how it was written?
No.
Not at all.
No. It's just that the language was written in Aramaic. Remember, Aramaic spread widely in the world. If you know,
It is today.
yeah, if you went to Israel in, let's say, the 3rd century, 2nd century, 1st century BC, they would not be speaking Hebrew.
They'd be speaking
Yeah.
Arabic.
Now, in the temple, when they had temple service, they'd speak Hebrew. But their day-to-day language, it's almost like what happened with when the Greeks came in. You know, they Hellenized the world, as we call it, and so they spread their language, and so the Jews picked up Greek. And that's why the Old Testament was translated into Greek, called the Septuagint. You know, in the same way, when Rome came in, they spread Latin. So what did people speak then? Latin. Because it was the commercial government language as a result. So that's part of the reason why. Now, let's get into the historical background of the book of Daniel. Why don't you put up the map there? We've got a couple maps for you to help you
It's
picture.
there.
Right there, to picture some things. Now, at the time, yeah, we'll get there.
Which do you want?
I want the map.
You want them?
That's the map.
You want
Okay.
mine?
Now, at this time, here is Babylon. This area around Babylon is called Shinar. They're almost used synonymously. Sometimes they'll talk about Shinar, sometimes because Shinar is the plain that Babylon is built on. It's almost like talking about Delaware County and the city of Delaware. Okay? Shinar is the area, if you want to call it the township, but it's literally a plain, topologically a plain. Okay? So, at this time, this is around 605, or a little bit before 605, Babylon was a city-state, almost like the Greek city-states were in the 7th and 8th, 6th century BC. It was not yet an empire, because all this area was controlled by our friends that we just studied in Amos, the Assyrians. They controlled all of this territory, okay, except for Egypt, except for this smaller area here. But things are going to change in a big way, and we're going to see how they change. So for several hundred years, Babylon lived as a city-state inside the greater area of the Assyrian Empire. Now in 612 BC, okay, the Babylonian and Median military started a conquest led by the Babylonian king Nabopolassar. Nabopolassar is the father of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is his son and becomes one of his major generals. Okay? So they end up driving the Assyrians west back past the Euphrates River. So they start driving the Assyrians this way. There's two major battles that occur. One, noted here, is Carchemish. There's another one really close to it called the Battle of Haran.
What's the distance you're dealing with?
From here to here?
Haran, there's Haran.
300 miles, maybe-ish, I'd say. Probably another 200-ish from Haran down into the better part of Israel. That's approximately what we're talking about. So, what happened is, as they started to march this way, and they had some of the Medians from up here that coordinated with them, they started to take all these areas in these cities, okay? The Assyrians have been weakened by this time. Their empire is on the decline big time. They end up engaging, on this one you can't go back the other map. Yeah, they end up engaging Egypt, all right? They end up making an alliance, a military alliance, with Pharaoh Necho II. And also, interestingly, as well, Necho and the Assyrians also make an alliance with Judah. Okay? At that point, Josiah is the king. So we can read about this. Turn to 2 Kings 23. And let's read some of what the history is about this. 2 Kings 23. It's amazing when you start to look through your Bible how the history's all there. You just have to dig it out. 2 Kings 23, starting in verse 28. Okay? Now the rest of the acts of Josiah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah? In his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates, and King Josiah went to meet him. And when Pharaoh Necho saw him, he killed him at Megiddo. Now, Josiah has been warned by the prophets over and over again, do not resist Babylon. God says through Ezekiel, he says through Jeremiah, he is my instrument to punish Judah because of its sins. Don't resist him. What does Josiah do? He resists him. What happens? He dies. Okay?
That seems to be a very strong pattern when God gets upset with somebody.
Well, yeah, God warned him very clearly, this is not what you should do. Do not make an alliance with him. It will not go well, and it did not go well.
Well, the same thing for kings that followed him.
Yes. Yeah, we're going to go through them. So now turn to your right to 2 Chronicles. I'll show you another area, 2 Chronicles 25. It's another element of this history. I'm sorry, 2 Chronicles 35, not 25. Starting in verse 20. This is again about a little bit more information about Josiah in this battle at Megiddo, where Necho's coming north. Josiah and his army meets them at Megiddo, and Necho kills him, okay? Starting verse 20. After all of this, when Josiah had set the temple in order, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to make war at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out to engage him, okay? So in other words, he's coming up here. They meet at Megiddo. Josiah gets killed. The Assyrians are coming this way. They coordinate with the Egyptians coming up, and they all end up here at Carchemish. This is where the Babylonians and Medians meet them. So they end up at this big battle of Carchemish. Okay? So it says, but Necho sent messengers, verse 21, to Josiah saying, what have we to do with each other, O king of Judah? Now listen to what Necho says. It's really interesting. I am not coming against you today, but against the house with which I am at war. And God has ordered me to hurry. Think about that. This is the Pharaoh of Egypt. Okay? God has ordered me to hurry. Stop for your own sake from interfering with God who is with me, and he may not destroy you. Isn't that fascinating? That Necho knew he was being brought up there by the hand of God.
So Necho was more communicative with our God than actually Josiah.
Apparently, at least Necho listened and Josiah didn't. That's for sure. So look at verse 22. Now Josiah would not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to make war with him, nor did he listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but came to make war on the plain of Megiddo. And the archer shot King Josiah. And the king said to his servants, take me away, for I am badly wounded. So his servants took him out of the chariot and carried him in the second chariot which he had, and brought him to Jerusalem, where he died and was buried in the tombs of his fathers. And all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. Josiah was actually a good king.
Yeah, he was.
Okay? He did a lot of good things, but at a critical moment, he didn't listen. Because Jeremiah had told him very clearly, do not do this. The Lord will not be with you. Okay? Look at verse 25. Then Jeremiah chanted a lament for Josiah, and all the male and female singers speak about Josiah in their lamentations to this day. And they made them an ordinance in Israel. Behold, they are also written in the book of Lamentations. So, that's what begins. Josiah dies, and this coalition ends up coming to Carchemish, where there's a big battle.
Do you think Josiah thought because I am Jewish, I am the king, God's king, that he couldn't speak through Necho?
Maybe, but Jeremiah had already told him, and Ezekiel had already told him. I mean,
know,
two
but-
prophets had told him really clearly, do not do this. He didn't listen, okay?
And the 30-cent question is, why did he not listen? Is this Satan causing that? There has to be a reason
Maybe,
for
yeah.
him to function that way.
Yeah, he had made a decision prior that he was going to make an alliance with Assyria. And again, he was told, don't make an alliance with Assyria. And he made it anyway. Because God told him the Assyrians are not going to help you. Because the Babylonians are going to, I mean, we could go through all kinds of the prophets here. I'm not going to take the time. They clearly, we'll look at it a little bit, but the prophets clearly said God's hand is on the Babylonians. He is bringing them in, and they're going to conquer Judah. I mean, there was no doubt from the mouth of the prophets what was going to happen. That's why he told him, don't make an alliance with Assyria. It will not work.
Well, Israel had already been carried into captivity.
Well, Israel had, correct. Right, that's true. So only Judah was left. We're talking about Judah now here. So, this coalition of Assyria and Egypt attacked the Babylonians at Haran, but they were defeated, and Nebuchadnezzar's army then crushes them very close by. You see where, okay, so here they have a battle, and they lose, and they're pushed west, okay? Not that far, but they're pushed to the west. Right around here is the Euphrates. It's not really on the map, I don't think, here, but anyway. So then there's another major battle here at Carchemish. This is in 605 BC, and there they are completely crushed by the Babylonian and Median army. So Nebuchadnezzar then learns right after the battle that his father has died, Nebuchadnezzar. He then, after this battle, goes back to Babylon because he has to become king. He has to be installed as king. So he does so. Quickly goes back. But in September of 605 BC, he comes back to Israel. Now, during this time, the next king had been installed as a king of, I say Israel, I really mean Judah, okay? All right, the south. Like Ian said, Israel itself, the north, had already been taken away by the Assyrians. So, in September 605, the Judean king after Josiah, his name was Jehoiakim. So you have right here. There's 3 months where there's a guy named Jehoahaz who he dies, and so he's almost irrelevant. He's on the throne for 3 months. But the next person that really takes over is Jehoiakim. He actually rules for 11 years. He starts in about 609 and ends in 597. And again, you'll see, we'll go to references in 2 Kings 23. You'll see about him. Now, Jehoiakim has been told clearly that do not resist Babylon. What does he do? He resists Babylon. Okay? So, Nebuchadnezzar sieges the city, and of course, he takes the city as Jehoiakim rebels against him. Turn to 2 Chronicles 36. We were there in 35, so go to 2 Chronicles 36, and we'll see a little bit about Jehoiakim in verses 5 through 8. All right? Starting verse 5 of 2 Chronicles 36. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, just like we saw in the chart here. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, his God. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against him and bound him with bronze chains to take him back to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also brought some of the articles of the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in his temple at Babylon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and the abominations which he did, and what was found against him, behold, are they not written in the book of the kings of Israel, of Judah? And Jehoiakim, and Jehoiachin, his son, became king in his place. So Nebuchadnezzar invades in 605. Okay? He then they estimate probably 10,000 exiles. This is where Daniel goes to Babylon. Okay? After a couple-year siege against Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar breaches the walls. People are killed, obviously, in the battle. About 10,000 exiles are taken. Daniel and his buddies are that first group that go. But what Nebuchadnezzar does is he installs Jehoiachin in the place of the former king that he bound up with bronze chains and took back to Babylon. So the second puppet king is now installed, and his name, of course, is Jehoiachim. Now, Jehoiachim also decides not to listen to the prophets, of course.
Wasn't he young?
Yes, he's pretty young. We'll look at him.
18 years.
Yeah, we're going to look at him here in just a second in the same chapter in 2 Chronicles. Okay? Of course, he decides that he's going to rebel against Babylon, and therefore God brings Nebuchadnezzar back a second time. So, are you still in 2 Chronicles 36?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then jump down to verse 11. Okay? Well, let's go to 9 first. Jehoiachim was 8 years old, as Ann said, okay, when he became king, and he reigned 3 months, 10 days, and did evil in the sight of the Lord. I don't know how he
It's
could.
interesting because
Done.
in Russian it's 18.
Oh, really? It's 18?
Russian is 18.
Yeah. Okay. And at the turn of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar brought him to Babylon with the valuable articles of the house of the Lord, and he made his kinsman Zedekiah king over Judea and Jerusalem. So Zedekiah is now king starting in about 597 BC. All right? So let's read. So Zedekiah, true to nature, the Judean kings, being told by God not to rebel and resist Babylon, what does he do? He rebels and resists Babylon. So let's read in verses 11. Starting in verse 11 of 2 Chronicles 36. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord his God. In other words, Baal worship, idolatry. He did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke for the Lord. And he also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear allegiance by God. Now think about that. Nebuchadnezzar makes him swear allegiance by Jehovah, that he's going to behave himself if he makes him king. So he made an oath. He breaks it. Okay? Breaks the oath, breaks the agreement with Nebuchadnezzar, and decides not to pay a bit of attention to Jeremiah. Right? So it says he rebelled against him, even though he made an oath by God, but he stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning to the Lord God of Israel. Furthermore, all the officials of the priests and the people were very unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations. In other words, they included every kind of imaginable idolatry. And they defiled the house of the Lord with which he had sanctified in Jerusalem. Verse 15, and the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised God's words, scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore, verse 17, he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, that is, Nebuchadnezzar, who slew their young man with a sword in the house of the sanctuary, and had no compassion on the young man, or even virgin, or old man, or the infirm, and he gave them into his hand. And all the articles of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and his officers, he brought them to Babylon. Okay? So, he comes back a second time. Okay, approximately 596, and does this. All right? Now, this, of course, 596, 597 is when he returns the second time. You might want to also turn to your right, to the left, I'm sorry, to 2 Kings. Go to 2 Kings 24. And let's read a little bit more history about this. 2 Kings 24. And we're going to look at verses 1 through 10. in the day.
8:20. He's 20.
I'm sorry, 8 through 20. I'm sorry. So again, this is backing up to Jehoiachin, and it's interesting. There may be a numerical issue there because look what it says. Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king. Okay.
So Russian is right.
So it may be that there was a error of in Hebrew, if you put a dot in the wrong place, that's probably like Chinese. Or if you change a tiny what's called dot or tittle, it can change the number. Okay, so maybe someone made a minor error there and said 8 when it's supposed to be 18. But at any rate, so he becomes king. He reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was da-da-da-da-da. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. So again, verse 10. And at the time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, went to Jerusalem, and the city came under siege. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, and he and his mother and his servants and his captains and his officials. So the king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. And he carried out from there all the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king's house, cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon, the king of Israel, had made in the temple. So he starts to take pieces off the temple, golden elements, and all the adornments that were on it, and he led all these away into exile and into Jerusalem, all the captives. This is verse 14 now.
Now that was Solomon's time.
Yes, exactly. And all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, all the craftsmen and all the smiths, none remained except the poorest of the poor. So he led Jehoiachin away to exile in Babylon, and also his mother. And of course the men of valor. So and then of course we get to to Zedekiah. So he installs Zedekiah for what's left in Judea.
So in verse 12, when Jehoiachin went out to the king of Babylon, he went out to fight. Is that right?
No, I think he went to try to beg, personally. Okay. He brings his mother out there, and he's asking for mercy. And, of course, he's already rebelled. This is the second time Nebuchadnezzar's come back now to Jerusalem, all right? And Nebuchadnezzar's like, you're gone, and takes his mother, the family, all these people into exile.
He was 26 years old.
Right, there's 26 if you add it together. So then, of course, he installs Zedekiah. Zedekiah starts then when he leaves in about 597. So let's read verses 17 through 20 of 2 Kings 24. Then the king of Babylon made his uncle Mattaniah king in his place and changed his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king. He reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Hamutal, and the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. I don't think that's the prophet. I think it's a different Jeremiah. But he did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that Jehoiakim had done. And through the anger of the Lord, this came about in Jerusalem and Judah until he cast them out from his presence. And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So now in 588, the third rebellion has occurred in Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar comes back with his army. By this time, you can probably conclude he's saying to himself,
They're like annoying flies.
that's right. I am done with you. I'm not coming back again. This is it. He sieges the city for 2 years. In 586, he slaughters people. He tears down the walls of the city. He completely destroys Solomon's temple and takes away anyone that's worth taking away back to Babylon. Jerusalem now, after this third siege, becomes a literal ghost town. Let's read about it. You're already in 2 Kings 24. Let's go to 2 Kings 25 and read verses 1 through 10. Now it came about in the 9th year of the reign, and the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, and all his army against Jerusalem, camped against it, and built a siege wall around it. So the city was under siege until the 11th year of Zedekiah. So it's about a 2-year siege time, okay? On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. The city was broken into, and all the men of war fled by night by way of the gate between the 2 walls between the king's garden, though the Chaldeans were all around the city. The Babylonians were all around it. And they went there by the way of the Arabah. In other words, they get out of the city and they start to go west and east and south towards the Dead Sea area, the Arabah. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. So they made it all the way down the Judean wilderness, down off of the Jerusalem's on a mountain. And if you go east, you go downhill towards Jericho. And all his army was scattered from him. And they captured the king and brought him to the king of Babylon at Riblah. And he passed sentence on him. And they slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes of Zedekiah and bound him with bronze fetters and brought him to Babylon. And on the 11th day of the 5th month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. And he burned the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned with fire. So all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls of Jerusalem. He leveled Jerusalem. Ghost town.
So that was the end of the temple.
That was the end of Solomon's temple. It was the end of the king's palace. It was the end of the gardens. It was the end of everything. They were done with having to go back.
Was Solomon's temple the first temple?
Yes.
You
Okay.
look at all this, compare it to God's 10 Commandments. If you look at the 10 Commandments, there's a lot of things that go on in here that are in violation of these 10 Commandments.
In the sense of whose behavior you're talking about.
The murders,
Jews?
So you're talking about the Jews, you're talking about Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon.
Nebuchadnezzar to start with.
Well, I'm certain he didn't know about the 10 Commandments at this point.
Yeah.
You know, he's a pagan. He's not a Jew. Obviously, he knows very little about Judaism. I'm certain the Hebrews are a complete enigma to him, you know, except they're annoying the you-know-what out of him.
If he's a pagan, okay, and he's listening to whom? The prophets, right?
No, he isn't. He isn't listening to prophets. He didn't know anything about the prophets. He's coming.
listening to his own.
He's listening to his own advisors. He's a Babylonian. Okay? Now, interestingly though, even though at first he clearly knows nothing about, part of the intriguing element of the book of Daniel is how Daniel teaches him about God.
Right.
And he has some really dramatic experience with God in the 4th chapter.
Yes, yes.
Okay? He is humbled by God. So he carries away all the Jews, and he carries away all the temple treasures, and he carries away all this stuff, but he doesn't understand what he's getting. He's getting the presence of God now in Babylon, and it's going to create problems for him. All right? But remember, up until a point, he's a complete pagan.
Yeah, but he's also under the direction of God to destroy the city.
He is.
That's where it got
He is.
confusing.
He doesn't know God. He doesn't know the Torah, but God moves him to do this. He is put historically in a position where God says, I'm using you.
Doesn't he also frequently kind of listen to God, or
He defies God, is humbled by God, and listens to God. And that's part of what we'll be going through in the chapters.
Like who told Josiah not to, what we just read?
Jeremiah and Ezekiel told them over and over and over again. Said Nebuchadnezzar has come. God's using him to punish Judah and to exile them. Do not resist. All those things, all of them did it. You know, and Josiah didn't listen. You know, well, Jehoaz is insignificant. Jehoiakim doesn't listen. Jehoiachin, of course, he's insignificant too. And then the final one, Zedekiah, he doesn't listen. And so, go ahead.
Would any of that have happened if Hezekiah had listened to Jeremiah and didn't show Nebuchadnezzar all the riches that he had?
It's a very, very good point, Jack. Hezekiah made a very big blunder. Okay,
After God gave him 15 more years.
God, he pleads to God to live 15 years longer. Please, and God goes like, okay, you know, and of course, you know, God's timing has reasons for it, but he makes an exception for Hezekiah. He lives 15 more years. Then he decides to brag to Nebuchadnezzar about all of the things in the temple, the gold, the silver, all he's accumulated. It's like, you know, it's like telling the local robber everything that's in your home. And you think he's going to stay away? Mm-mm. So you're right. It's a good point. Very good point.
So greed is still the root.
Well, part of it. Part of it.
That's what it is.
Well, the other part is that God is the God of history. And it's just like Cyrus, who ends up being the king of Media-Persians who conquers Babylon, which we'll see in the book of Daniel. Okay? Cyrus is named by his name by the prophet Isaiah 150 years before he was born. Isaiah says there's going to be a guy from the Media-Persians. His name's going to be Cyrus, and he's going to be my shepherd, Isaiah says. He's going to lead my people back to Israel. That's exactly what happens.
Well, God tells him to give him all the everything they need.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely illogical. He not only lets them go, but then gives them money to do it.
Yeah, whatever they need, give it to them.
Exactly. I mean, God's hand was heavily on Cyrus. Wouldn't shock me if Cyrus ends up rubbing elbows with us there in heaven too. You know? Now, last thing before we stop.
And many people probably won't see.
Yeah, there'll be people that we thought would be there wrong. But, all right, last thing. I want to point out something. There are two different desolations that occur in this time frame. And I want you to understand what they are. The first is called the desolation of Israel. It begins, obviously, in 605 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar first comes and conquers Israel and makes it a vassal state, vassal city, vassal country. Now, Judah, Judah, you know, the south, loses its sovereignty, and it ends up, of course, they lose the temple, but by the decree of Cyrus in 536, they go back to Jerusalem. So if you subtract 605 approximately BC, or 606, from 536, what do you get? 70 years. So what we call the desolation of Israel is 70 years length. That's their captivity in Babylon.
Now, are you talking about Israel or Judah?
Well, I'm talking technically about Judah. I'm sorry. You know, I'm talking about the south because the north is gone. All right. So if I say Israel, I'm thinking of the whole country the way it was originally.
But Israel was already in captivity.
They were already taken away by the Assyrians.
Yeah.
Right. Now, there's another desolation, and we call it the desolation of the temple. Because remember, the temple wasn't destroyed in 606 BC. It wasn't destroyed in 597 when Nebuchadnezzar came back the second time. It was destroyed the third time in 586.
When he'd had enough.
Right. He comes in, we just read it. He tore it apart. He tore the houses apart. He tore everything apart in 586.
Boy, Cat could have made millions and millions of dollars.
That's right. So 586 ends the temple. Now, they go into 70 years of captivity, right? They're allowed to come back. They go through about 20 years or so where they're not really doing too well in terms of putting Israel back together. But the first thing they do is they go back and start to work on the temple. This is the days of Nehemiah and Ezra and our friend Zechariah that we studied, remember?
Right.
All about him. These were his days. They finished the temple in 515 BC. If you subtract, what do you get? How long is a temple not around? 70 years. Now turn to Jeremiah 25.
This is why you taught constantly 1948 and now.
Right.
What was the second
7
siege?
years.
70 years.
Second siege was
97.
597.
Third ended in 586. Started in 588. And so turn to Jeremiah 25. We'll finish tonight with our buddy Jeremiah because God gives him some really important information.
What did you say on Jeremiah?
God gives him some really important information.
Now what section?
Jeremiah 25, 11 and 12.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So starting verse 11. This is what Jeremiah is telling the Judean people and the Judean kings before this ever happens. He says, and this whole land shall be a desolation and a horror. And by 586, it was a desolation and a horror. And these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Verse 12. Then it will be, when 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon, and that nation, declares the Lord, for their iniquity, and the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it an everlasting desolation. So, that's when he brings Cyrus of Media-Persia in to conquer Babylon. So, the number 70 is rather significant. It's over and over again. And as you pointed out, we should at least think that just like it isn't a coincidence that the desolation of the temple was 70 years and the desolation of Israel was 70 years, we should wonder about the fact that Israel's now been back in its land 70 years this year. So keep your eye on
That's right.
what's going on in Israel, because I'm going to suggest there's some significant events that are probably going to start occurring at this time. So that's
What are your suggestions that may occur, or what's your thoughts at this point?
well. I think
7
that
years.